Greetings to our attendees from across the globe. We have people from Serbia, United States, India, Ireland, United Kingdom, South Africa, Venezuela, Germany, France, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, and of course, Canada joining us today. On behalf of the Canadian International Internet Dispute Resolution Center, David, next slide, please. I, Ina Ergasheva, Director of Operations, extend a warm welcome to each of you gathered here today for our session titled Calculating Brand Protection ROI, an overview of frameworks and methodologies. For those of you who are new to CIDRC, CIIDRC is recognized as an approved dispute resolution provider by the Internet Corporation for Assigned Name and Numbers, known as ICANN, standing as one of only 6 globally approved UDRP providers. With over 2 decades of experience, we have been a trusted service provider for the Canadian Internet Registration Authority, or CIRAM, effectively handling disputes related to .ca domain names. In a world where every click, swipe, or tap shapes perceptions and influences decisions, the value of safeguarding brands cannot be underestimated. In the digital landscape, a domain name serves as a crucial gateway to a brand's online presence. Ensuring rightful ownership and proper usage of domain names becomes paramount to shield against unauthorized alterations, misleading affiliations, or cyber-squatting activities. This is where CIIDRC's core strengths come into play. Known for its efficiency, cost advantage, responsiveness, expert panelists, and a user-friendly online platform, CIIDRC's role as an approved provider for domain name disputes resolution is rapidly expanding. Today, we embark on exploration into a realm often overlooked, but profoundly impactful. We're here to uncover the metrics and methodologies that define the true worth of safeguarding brands. We're privileged to welcome 2 speakers who bring a wealth of experience and insights about today's topic. Firstly, we have David Barnett, a seasoned professional with nearly 2 decades of expertise in the online brand protection. David's journey began in 2004 at Envisional, subsequently moving to significant roles at NetNames and CSC before assuming his current position as brand protection strategist at Stops. He is not only an accomplished thought leader, but also the author of Brand Protection in the Online World, boasting an extensive portfolio of articles and a history of speaking engagements at industry events. David is a graduate of the University of Cambridge with an MA in Natural Science and a PhD in Planetary Geophysics. Joining us alongside David is Maria Alexandra Lopez Garcia, or Alex. Alex is a Venezuelan lawyer and industrial property agent, brings over 20 years of experience in distinctive science and domain names within both public and private sectors, spanning national and international arenas. Notably, her tenure with the WIPO, World Intellectual Property Arbitration and Mediation Center, overseeing more than 500 UDRP and CC/TLD disputes, underscores her expertise. Since 2017, Alex has spearheaded her own firm dedicated exclusively to resolving intellectual property rights infringements on the internet. Alex has been a member of our UDRP and CDRP experts since 2020, delivering numerous decisions which are accessible through our website, ciidrc.org. Today, we are pleased to have them share their insights and expertise in the realm of brand protection and ROI calculation. Without further ado, I invite first Alex and then David to enlighten us on this crucial subject. Thank you, and let's begin our session.
Thank you very much, Ina, for that incredible introduction. David, next slide, please. Okay, as many of you know, or maybe not, the CII-DRC or CIDRC Center, which is one of the providers, the UDRP providers, is located in Vancouver, Canada. Next one, please. Also, here you do have just a summary about the policies that they administer, which is for the .ca for .canada, and also for the UDRP, where you can find different resources related with the policies and the rules. Next one, please. Yeah, also and on this slide, you can find, you can also in the website, you can find everything that you need related, even when it's with when to file a complaint or how to file a CII-DRC or CIDRC complaint, which is easier to pronounce, and also related with the response. You can also find related with the .ca, everything that you need to file, if it's a complaint or if it's a response, and also related with the description of the procedure. Next one, please. Next one, yeah. Also, the center is related, has their own social networks, which we invite you to subscribe, which is in the Twitter channel, also in LinkedIn, and you can also find on YouTube, where you're going to find this presentation as well, and also as other master classes related with the UDRP and also with the CIDRC activities. Next one, please, David. Yeah, but today, what brings us today? Today is a topic that I was fascinated when I discovered it, and David knows that. And I really wanted to bring it here in order to bring new ideas and also to make us think about these relevant certain questions. In this masterclass, I'm going to briefly talk to you about this IP infringements on the internet, frequent UDRP cases scenario, which at the end bring me to this specific point, questions that we will discuss, and then the answer. Okay, next one, please. Okay, I'm going to talk to you about 4 different IP infringements on the internet, which are, many of you or not, are related or familiarized with cybersquatting, which is cybersquatting. What it is the registration of a trademark as a domain name in bad faith, and should comply with the UDRP or with the respective policy for the CCTLD, if it's a UDRP variation in that case. Social networks. What do we mean? What do we mean when we talk about social networks? Well, nowadays that there are millions of users related with with Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, X, or any of the social networks where the trademark is used, even when it's as it is in the user, or if it is in the account as such. But each one has their own scenario who has to be analyzed as well, and also do have I would say like his own procedure, which is administered by their own platform. But it's possible to remove that account through a takedown, what is known as the takedown. Then we do have fake websites where they are not specifically or they are not necessary cybersquatting cases per se. They are when the trademark is used in an authorized way through the website. Then relate with the online markets, where the trademark is used either is in Amazon, Alibaba, or eBay, Etsy, Facebook, Mercado Libre, Walmart, or any other. Next one, please, David. Okay, but in relation with different cases scenario or UDRP case scenario, I wanted to bring you the cases that lead me to David, which was when we find an inactive domain name case, for example. It can be a passive holding case. It is that is to be solved through the passive holding doctrine. What we know about is known as the passive holding doctrine. Sorry. Then the PPC cases or domain name parking, typo squatting, or phishing. Next one, please. When we take a look at, this is an example of an inactive domain name website. Of course, I cannot reveal here any kind of domain name since the cases are completely confidential. But this is what it usually can, passive holding case look, the website can look. Next one. Then there's an example for a PPC case with commercial complainant-related links, which is what really will lead us to solve it through the UDRP, and specifically with the third element. Then next one. Then we do have also this example when there is a domain name parking. Then in this case could be any registrar, but in this case could be, well, we mentioned GoDaddy, for example. Next one. Also related with typo squatting cases, when the website is active. Here I brought you two different cases related with that has been decided by Cedric. One is between Shopify and Incorporate versus David Hu, related with Shopify. They talk here about the first element was typo squatting, but also then the domain name was redirected to one of the respondents' website. And as you can see also in the second case, Almond Wealth, when the trademark was Almond Wealth. Well, I think that I don't need to give you descriptions or to mention what Shopify is. This is a well-known trademark, but yeah, but these are two cases where that is related with typo squatting and an active content. And next one, please. Then cases related with phishing. These also are two cases that were administered by Cedric, LaZondeIndustries.com, also Arton Investment, and there you are, the trademarks. And then next one, please. Okay, once we already, I brought you these 5 examples related with the content of the websites. There is a fact as a IP lawyer, or when you provide this legal assessment related with UDRP cases or with UDRP variation cases, there is a fact that we cannot avoid. That is a trademark owners, they do have a budget for brand protection. So once that you do have, you receive the list of all the cases, of the cyber-squatted cases, or potentially cyber-squatted cases results, and you show them to your clients. One of the things that happened to me in my career, in my experience, it was, you propose this because you understand what is going on in the case, or you understand the risk or the implications of the existence of these domain names on the web that are related with the trademark owner. But happens that these trademark owners not only one time, but it was pretty frequent. They were asking me, but Alex, what am I losing with that inactive website? You showed it to them and they thought, oh, but there's nothing going on. Okay, and that led me to, but this is quite risky. And then you cite all these cases and you explain them to them, but they don't see the importance or the relevance of what, specifically because they don't understand what they are losing, specifically materially. Then what about the PPC cases? There are not, because we have to understand that, oh, well, I understand especially in my practice, particularly in this jurisdiction, that is not, we cannot assume that everybody knows about the UDRP or everybody is aware about cyber squatting. In particular with PPC cases that are not necessarily easy to explain. At least that your trademark owner is well familiarized with technology. And one of the most important questions was, but Alex, how much value? Tell me, how much money am I losing if I do not take action? Okay, so after digging and looking, one day I found, thank God I found with this guy, with David Barnett. So next slide. Sorry, next slide, maybe. Okay, I already talked about this, so we can go to the next slide. Because one of the things that we have to, that I was wondering in my process, it was what these trademarks understood. It was what Aldi understood, what Dunkin' Donuts or IMAX or Yes or Shopify, or it's coming out with OpenAI and ChatGPT. So in that process, next one, please. My answer was the ROI by David Barnett. So without, I'm not going to take too much. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to give the floor to David. So David, thank you very much for accepting this invitation. And so the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Enia, for having me. It's great to be able to have the opportunity to come and talk about the return on investment. So just a bit of an overview of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking initially just about some of the overall considerations of a brand protection program and why it's important to need to quantify the value of what you're doing as part of that. I think a lot of that has already been touched on, but I'll just kind of go over it again very quickly. I'm going to talk about a couple of key areas where there are sort of standard established methods for calculating return on investment. And then there'll be a sort of slightly more detailed section on how those ideas can be extended to be applicable to other areas. I probably won't go through all the detail there. There's quite a lot of information on some of the slides. But if anyone wants to follow up with any more kind of questions or more kind of insight into the detail, then feel free to follow up with me after the session. And at the end, we're just going to talk about some other factors to consider when it comes to ROI, brand protection, and some of the general caveats and the cautionary things to bear in mind when you're trying to calculate return on investment. Really, this is going to be quite general and quite broad. It's going to be looking at return on investment across a few different areas of brand protection, so not just domains, but some of these other areas as well that Alex has touched upon, but really hopefully give you a flavor of some of the different ideas that can be used. So again, as Alex sort of mentioned earlier, when you come to sort of be thinking about running a brand protection program as a brand owner, there are cost implications associated with that. Generally speaking, you will be using some sort of monitoring technology that may be in-house. It may be using a brand protection service provider. There will usually be some sort of analyst resource to actually go through that data, maybe advise on the monitoring, advise on the enforcements, or carrying out some of that for you. And on the brand owner side, there's various sort of requirements from the stakeholder that are necessary to put the program in place. So there's a requirement to oversee the program, liaising with any service provider that the brand owner may be using, collecting together the various pieces of information that are needed to set up the monitoring, having an IP portfolio which is kind of set up properly and maintained. And all of that takes time and money. And so as part of your brand protection program, there's a number of different types of issue that you're looking to address. Some of those are more obviously quantitative, so things like lost sales. So you can think of areas like where counterfeits are being sold, traffic misdirection. So that would be things like brand seeding, where the brand name is being used to direct traffic to competitor sites, instances where funds and payments are being stolen. So again, thinking of things like phishing. Again, in order to tackle that, you need an element of monitoring to find the problems and enforcement to take them down. And all of these things have a direct financial impact, and it's fairly easy to see where that comes in. Some of the other areas you'll be looking at will tend to be more qualitative. So some of the bad internet content that you may be finding may be damaging reputation and brand value. That feels more qualitative, but actually, again, as we'll see, there are ways of quantifying some of those issues. And again, from a brand owner point of view, there may be other reasons why brand protection is important. So depending on the industry you work on, there may be regulatory reasons having a program in place. But overall, you're spending time and money to do brand protection. So there is this requirement to quantify the value of that program. And that is often important to justify the spend on putting the program in place in the first place. So there's a few kind of key areas where there are sort of well-established methods for calculating return on investment. And I'm going to be talking about those two areas first. So the first of those, which is probably the most directly relevant to the sort of the areas we've been talking about, is in domain recovery processes. So what I'm talking about here is where we find a domain that is infringing in some way, is currently under the ownership of a third party, and the brand owner is able to reclaim that domain via a dispute process. And again, there are various conditions where that might be the case. So generally speaking, for a domain to be eligible to be reclaimed through a dispute process, there are a number of conditions that typically need to be met. So you can see those listed here. Typically, there will be things like the domain name needs to contain the brand owner's trademark or similar. The brand owner wants to take ownership of that domain name, and the domain needs to qualify for recovery. And in terms of what we mean by qualifies for recovery, generally that will be dependent on the factors that are listed at the bottom there. So generally, we require that the brand owner's trademark rights need to predate the creation of the domain name. The domain name needs to be confusingly similar to the mark. The current owner must not have legitimate rights or interest to that domain name, and there must be indicators of bad faith. And if all of those conditions are met, then generally there will be a possibility of reclaiming that domain by the brand owner through some sort of dispute process. If we are able to do that, then once the brand owner has the domain under their ownership, they're able to then redirect any web traffic that was going to that domain to their own official website. And in so doing, a proportion of that extra traffic can be converted to generate revenue for the brand owner. And that is essentially the basis of our return on investment calculation in this area. In order to do that, you need a number of kind of inputs or pieces of data. You need to know how much traffic that website is getting. And then once you've added that extra traffic to your website as a brand owner, you need to know how much of that can be converted into revenue. So what proportion of the visitors will tend to make a purchase or become a customer? And if they do, how much will they typically spend? And again, we'll formulate that a little bit more formally on the next couple of slides. As with all of the things I'm going to talk about, there are a number of caveats and considerations to bear in mind when you're doing this. And really what we're trying to say with these is it's never quite as simple as the simplest formulation, and you can make these calculations as complex as you like, essentially, and build in any of these other areas that you might want to try and reflect in the value of what you're doing. So one of those things to bear in mind is that the value of the site may vary depending on the search terms for which the domain is returned. So that potentially impacts on the conversion rate. So again, if the domain is served up in Google, say, in response to a very highly relevant search term, then potentially it's a more valuable site and the conversion rate will be higher. From a sort of purely practical point of view, the approach I've talked about, where once you've acquired a domain, you redirect the traffic to your official site, you don't always necessarily want to do that because it can lead to the impression of affiliation between the domain and your own official site. And if it's some sort of unsavory site, some sort of site that you don't want to claim affiliation with, you may not be wanting to do that. So sometimes a brand owner will acquire a domain and then hold it inactive for a period of time, and then decide whether the brand owner wants to keep it and use it as part of their domain portfolio to maybe be used in the future. So this is really how the components fit together. So as I said, the pieces of data are shown on the left. Some of those are data that you can measure. Some of those are assumed values. So essentially what you're trying to do is you look at the number of visitors the domain is getting. Generally, that can be gone either from a third-party data source. So typically, brand owners or service providers will use something like SimilarWeb or Comscore to give a measure of domain traffic. Once you've acquired the domain, of course, you can actually directly measure how much traffic it gets because you have it under your control, and you will have web server information on how much traffic that domain is getting. Usually web traffic data is given in terms of numbers of visitors per day. So to sort of scale that up to do your return on investment calculation, you generally want to scale that up to a number of visitors per year. In order to do that, you'll need to work out what proportion of those daily visitors are repeat visitors, because obviously you're not going to get a certain completely separate set of visitors each day for a whole year. There will be a certain proportion of repeat visitors. And then, as I've said, what you then want to do is say, of those visitors that you're kind of adding to your official brand owner's website, what proportion of them will be converted into customers and how much typically will they spend? Again, another caveat at the top right there, this approach is kind of most meaningful for things like e-commerce websites, but maybe less so for something like a phishing site, where in that case, the value is maybe more reasonably determined by things like the numbers of victims and the average loss per victim, rather than ideas around visitor spend. So really, once you have these, obviously there's a lot of assumptions that go into this, but once you're happy with the general approach, you can essentially just plug in the numbers and it all kind of comes out. So for example, if you had a domain that was getting 100 visitors a day, you might say that over the course of a year, 25% of those aggregated over that year would be repeat visitors. So the total number of visitors per year wouldn't be 100 times 365. That number will be reduced by this kind of repeat visitor factor. So that gives you a total number of visitors per year. Once you've added those extra visitors to your site, you could say, okay, well, maybe 5% of those will end up making a purchase. And of the ones that do make a purchase, they'll spend a particular amount of money, let's say £50. You plug those numbers together and that will give you a number of the value of reclaiming that domain. Obviously, all of those numbers are flexible and can be tweaked based on, you know, the brand owner's own understanding of their own business conversion rates, customer spends, and so on. It's worth saying that, you know, even where you're not recovering a domain, you can still use similar approaches. So if we think about things like an e-commerce site which you're deactivating rather than reclaiming the domain for yourself, or a site with pay-per-click links that you're just removing. So in those cases, you're not reclaiming the full traffic that was going to those sites. You're maybe just reclaiming a portion of it. So really what to do in those situations is you need to make assumptions regarding the proportion of the total traffic which can be reclaimed. And that can be dependent on a number of factors. So things like the range of brands. So if, for example, we're thinking of what we sometimes call a mono brand site, so that's a site where only a single brand is being infringed, you could then maybe make the case that the majority of that traffic to that site would be intended for the brand in question. Conversely, if there are multiple brands being infringed, you know, it's likely that only a proportion of the total traffic relates to any of one of the specific individual brands. Furthermore, the similarity of the domain name to that of the official site can be important. So a greater degree of similarity could be associated with a greater degree of customer confusion and therefore potentially a greater proportion of reclaimability in the web traffic from that website. Moving on now to the second area where we can carry out sort of fairly simple return on investment calculation. So this is in cases of e-commerce marketplace enforcement. So what we're talking about there is typically instances of infringing goods being sold on e-commerce marketplaces. So things like counterfeits, trademark infringements. What we're doing is we're taking down those listings because the goods are infringing, and we're working out how much that takedown action is worth, essentially. There's a couple of different contexts in which you can do that. The first is a sort of potential return on investment calculation that you carry out before you've even started running the program based on the numbers of listings that are out there. And the second type of calculation you can carry out is what we call a post-enforcement return on investment calculation based on the number of listings you've actually taken down once the program has been running from a period of time. The first type is probably slightly easier to formulate and slightly easier to understand. So essentially what you're doing there, so this is before you've done any type of enforcement at all, you just take a look at the marketplaces that are out there, you search for the brand name that you're interested in, and you see how many listings are out there. And then from that, you try and make some assumptions about how many infringing listings that will equate to, and therefore what you could gain by taking those down. So generally you'd go to the different marketplaces, you'd search for the brands, you'd find out how many, and then you'd need to make assumptions about how many of those are typically likely to be infringing. So in order to do that, the way that's normally done is based on insights that you get from previous monitoring. So you'll know that on marketplace X, we typically find that in an individual listing, there may be a certain number of items included in that individual listing. So if something like eBay, there tend to be small numbers of items associated with each listing, whereas on maybe some of the more business-to-business sites, things like Alibaba, you might find that there's 1,000 or 100,000 listings. Again, obviously, all of this is dependent on things like product type. But you can make a sort of order of magnitude guess of the number of items that are typically offered per individual listing per site, and also per site, the proportion of listings which are typically infringing. So again, you might find based on your previous monitoring as a service provider, you could say that actually on something like eBay, we find that more of the listings tend to be legitimate. They tend to be things like secondhand goods being sold by legitimate owners, where on some of the, for example, some of the Chinese marketplace sites, you might find a higher proportion of infringing listings typically. Once you've got all that in place, you can formulate a calculation in the same way. So for your brand, you look at the number. So this is something that we're doing per marketplace. So on each marketplace, we look at the number of listings that we find for the brand in question. We convert that number of listings to a number of items by using the assumed typical number of items per listing. We then say what percentage of those are typically infringing. That gives you at the top right the total number of infringing items, and then having taken those infringing items down, we say how much revenue are we likely to be able to reclaim by doing that. So to do that, we need basically two pieces of information. There is a substitution rate, which is essentially us saying what proportion of people who would have bought an infringing item will instead buy the legitimate item if the infringing item is taken down. And then the final piece of the puzzle is the average item price. So of those people who will then be kind of customers that we're able to reclaim for ourselves, how much will they spend by buying the legitimate item? Now, when I talk about substitution rate, I'm using language slightly loosely. It actually has a couple of components within it. There is the fact that not all available items in a particular listing necessarily translate to a sale. So there is a kind of something equivalent to the conversion rate we were talking about earlier. And then there is what I would term the true substitution rate. So the substitution between customers buying an infringing product and those who will then instead buy the non-infringing product if the infringing version is made unavailable through a marketplace takedown. Once you're happy again with that approach, again, you can plug in the numbers and it kind of works in a similar way. So really the numbers you get out, and remember, this is before you've done anything at all from an enforcement point of view. This is just thinking what sort of volumes of infringing items that they're likely to be, what proportion of people who would have bought them will buy a legitimate item once we've taken them down. So therefore, how much is it likely to be worth to actually go through, find the listings which are genuinely infringing and take them down. So you can do this per marketplace, and it's kind of a way of building a case for the spend on the program in the first place. Okay.
Sorry, Dave, I just wanted to add here. So this can lead the client or the trademark owner to the answer, how much value am I losing? If it's in the marketplace, or if it is in social networks, or if it's with a cybersquatting case, or with a fake website, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, all of these ideas are kind of applicable to different areas. I mean, they're most easily formulated in specific cases, but I mean, there's something I'll go on to talk about a bit later on. You can kind of apply the general ideas to other areas and other types of infringements. You just maybe need to tweak the numbers and the assumptions slightly.
Yeah.
And we'll see some examples of that as we go.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So that was obviously pre-enforcement. Post-enforcement, you can do something similar, but in that case, you can base it on the actual numbers of what you have done. So once you've run a program of brand protection, monitoring and enforcement on marketplace, you will know how many items, how many listings you've actually taken down. Most brand protection service providers will actually scrape this data from the individual listings. So they will pull out things like price, quantity. So you will know the total number of items that you've taken down. And then obviously the only assumptions you need to make are things like the substitution rate and the item prices of the legitimate items to actually get the numbers out. There may be a need to apply data caps, which I'll come back to on the next slide, but doing it post-enforcement rather than pre-enforcement is obviously in some ways more satisfactory because it actually represents a truer reflection of the content which is genuinely actionable rather than just assuming 10% might be infringing. And then obviously once you've made those assumptions, you can use similar techniques to the ones we talked about to actually calculate the numbers. I talk about data caps. What you will often see in marketplace listings is individual listings that are offering very, very high volumes of items. So this is an example of a listing from, I think this is Alibaba. And you can see they're offering, so this is kind of raises a number of red flags. A listing like this, they're offering up to or over 10 million items. Now that does not necessarily suggest that they've got 10 million items sitting in a warehouse somewhere. What it probably suggests is that they'll manufacture on demand as much as the buyer wants. You can see at the bottom that they're also offering customized logo, customized packaging. So there's a real suggestion that this is associated with the supply chain for counterfeit goods. Now, if you were to just take the numbers at face value and say that by taking down this listing, you've taken down 10 million items, that's probably unrealistic because they don't have that sat in inventory somewhere. So what you typically do in these calculations is you'll apply a data cap. So something like, if we find a listing that's offering more than 1,000 items, we'll just assume that there's 1,000 items. Obviously, if we use a number like 10 million, the numbers get big very quickly and are somewhat unrealistic. So really going back to Alex's question just now, you can use similar ideas to carry out calculations in other contexts, including things like website, domain, deactivations, and other things, using similar ideas, but kind of changing the exact numbers and assumptions that you use. And obviously, this is all only possible where the data is available. So in some cases, you won't have measures of web traffic. So if you're doing a takedown on social media, it's irrelevant how much traffic Facebook.com gets. What you want to know is how much traffic does this individual posting get. So in those cases, you'll use metrics like the numbers of followers, numbers of likes, numbers of shares, and so on. Similarly, for infringing mobile apps, numbers like the numbers of downloads will be relevant. And then if you're looking at things like piracy or file sharing, really what you're interested in there is the number of individuals sharing that copyrighted content. So for example, something like BitTorrent, you can get information on things like numbers of seeds and leeches, and that will tell you how many people are sharing that content. Obviously, you can use other factors where it's available. So sometimes open source investigation techniques or online databases will give you information on the volumes of goods being sold through these infringing sites, and you can factor those numbers into your calculation. Okay, so moving on now, I just wanted to talk about a few ideas about how you can extend these ideas to cover off additional components of what might be relevant and important for return on investment calculation. There's quite a lot of content on these slides. So as I say, I'm not going to go through everything. I'm mindful of time, but I just kind of wanted to put some of the ideas out there. And as I say, if you want to catch up with me kind of offline to discuss any of this further, I'm happy to talk about it. So the first area I wanted to talk about is substitution rate. So as you'll recall, hopefully, this is basically a measure of the proportion of customers who will buy a legitimate item if the infringing item is made unavailable via a takedown action. So, in our sort of initial calculation, we just assumed a number, 10%. Whatever it might be, and that's fine, and you can do that. But if you want to do something slightly more sophisticated, you can actually use the idea of a variable substitution rate. So this graph on the right here, this is a formulation from a study by Charlie Abrahams, who some of you may know, and essentially what he's doing here is saying that the substitution rate will be dependent on price. So if you've got an item that normally would be very expensive, but it's being sold very cheaply, so it's an obvious counterfeit, then you will typically have a low substitution rate. Somebody who buys a fake Rolex for £10 is unlikely to buy a full-priced real Rolex. So as the unit price goes up, the substitution rate goes down. I personally would formulate this slightly as follows. So rather than looking at exact prices, I think probably what's more important is the price differential between the counterfeit item and the legitimate item. But the idea is kind of the same. So it's a measure of the kind of amount of underpricing and the price disparity between the infringing item and the real item. Of course, all of these things are kind of more complicated than the simplest formulation. So the substitution rate will depend on things like whether the customer knows they're buying a counterfeit versus whether they've been misled. It's also likely to be dependent on things like the platform type. So, for example, B2B platforms are likely, as you can see here, likely to represent an earlier stage in the supply chain, and they are likely to affect the appearance of items on other sites further down the supply chain. So again, that has an impact on the substitution rate that you use. Again, a couple of caveats really here to bear in mind. The first is that although, as we said, if you're looking at a counterfeit version of a high-end luxury item, that would imply a low substitution rate. That doesn't necessarily imply that the enforcement itself isn't worth doing, because actually keeping tabs on getting these infringing items out of the way can have a positive impact on brand reputation and value, as we will see. There's also a number of other factors that are important. And again, what we're really talking about here is that some brands are very badly affected by high levels of counterfeiting. It really damages their prestige and image, whilst others sort of seem to kind of still able to retain their desirability. Part of this difference might be to do with things like their pre-existing brand value, the quality of their marketing, but also there's other factors, things like the level of customer confusion between real and counterfeit goods, the degree of overlap in customer base for those real and counterfeit goods, and even the way in which the brand talks about the counterfeiting issue. So, you know, a brand that talks about the safety issues associated with buying counterfeit goods, you know, that may affect, you know, how damaging that counterfeiting activity might be. Second idea I just wanted to talk about is looking at the idea of long-term impact. So most of the sort of simple return on investment approaches, particularly the things I've talked about earlier, are really focused on the numbers of actions, the numbers of takedowns you're doing. In many brand protection programs, actually what's interesting to the brand owner is actually changing the landscape over time. So things like finding that as your brand protection program progresses, the number of infringements that you're seeing and having to deal with is dropping off over time. So this is at the bottom left here. This is a case study showing the number of enforcement actions required per month over a period of 2 years. And you can see this. Superficially, this looks like a successful program. The numbers of infringements are dropping off. So the assumption there is that we're making the brand a less attractive target for infringers. Some brand owners will want to clean the search results as their kind of main objective. So making sure that there's no infringing content listed on the first page of Google or the first page of results returned on a particular marketplace. Other brand owners will be more interested in making sure that they're the first listed provider through the buy button on a marketplace like Amazon, for example. So superficially, as I've said, having a sort of profile where the numbers go down over time looks like a measure of success, but as always, there are caveats. So when you see something like this, what might be happening is actually maybe the infringers are moving to other platforms that you're not monitoring. Maybe they're changing the way they describe the infringing items so that your existing monitoring isn't picking them up. So for example, at the top right here, we've got some examples of some counterfeit iPhones that were being sold with a misspelling of iPhone with an F rather than a PH. It may be that they're changing the types of infringements that are being sold over time. So really what I'm saying here is that, you know, if you just look at the numbers, it can be easy to be misled into thinking that your brand protection program is successful, but really you need to look at the bigger picture. Make sure you're monitoring across a range of marketplaces. You're monitoring for brand variations and misspellings just to make sure that you have a full picture of what's going on. However, that aside, if you accept all of those caveats, there are ways you can formulate a return on investment calculation to actually take account of the change in the landscape you see, assuming it is a real change, rather than just focusing on ongoing numbers of takedowns. And this is formulated over the next few slides. Now, again, these are a little bit complex, so I'm not going to go through it in all of the detail, but just kind of wanting to sort of set up this framework that you can use. So let's consider the case of a brand which is new, they're launching, they're selling products, they're starting in month 1. What you will tend to find after a brand launch is if it's a desirable brand, counterfeiters and other infringers will target it and they will sell infringing versions, counterfeit versions of the goods. So what you will typically find is that the infringements will start to ramp up over time. That's the red line you can see here. And then so there will be a certain number of new infringements appearing each month, let's say. We will probably also find that there will be a certain rate at which the infringements disappear off the internet as well. That will be things like sites that are short-lived and get deactivated by the infringers after they've been used for a time. If they set up an infringing domain, it will expire after a period of time. Content will gradually drop down search engine rankings and so on. So what will happen is that the total number of online infringements will creep up. It's the difference between the rate at which the infringements appear and the infringements disappear. But the blue line at the top basically the infringements will rise. They will probably reach a steady state after a period of time. We're not suggesting that the number of infringements will increase forever, even if you're not doing any enforcement. You know, that's not realistic. We can't really imagine a scenario where the internet is full of infringements for a particular brand. So it will probably level off after a period of time, which implies that the green line eventually catches up to the red line. But, you know, that could be over any time scale. It might be, you know, it might be 10 years. You might never get to that point. It might be the case that if you don't do any enforcement, you do see this blue line creeping up and up and up. And really the problem never goes away. So let's say as a brand owner, you're aware that you're in, you know, the first phase of this diagram here. You're seeing the infringements ramping up over time. And then what you do in month 12 is you switch on an enforcement program. So you start, so the black line here, you start in month 12, you start taking down those infringements. And obviously you need to be taking down the infringements at a faster rate than the rate at which they naturally appear. Otherwise the program is not going to be successful. You're presumably also therefore taking them down more quickly than they naturally disappear, which is why the green line drops off to 0. But essentially what happens is once you start taking down the infringements more quickly than they appear, then the total number of online infringements will drop, which is what we're seeing in this ramp down phase here. You can see the blue line climbs down, and eventually things again will reach a steady state, which I've called the whack-a-mole phase. So when I say whack-a-mole, I don't mean you're doing a sort of random or disordered program of enforcements. What I mean is you're reactively taking down new infringements as quickly as they appear. So you reach this steady state. So what does that mean in terms of your return on investment calculation? So if you think about the sort of the classic calculations that we talked about earlier, they tend to be formulated in a way where your return on investment is some sort of measure of the cost of the infringement being active multiplied by the number of infringements you've removed. So basically it's a measure of the number of takedowns you're doing on an ongoing basis, this value X that you can see on the graph here. Now, I'm proposing that actually a better way to think about it is to actually think about the value of your brand protection in terms of the impact of that program being in place. So actually, rather than thinking about X, the number of takedowns you're doing, what you should be doing is reflecting the difference between Y and X. So really saying if we weren't doing the brand protection, or if we stopped doing the brand protection, the level of infringements will go up to Y. So actually, really, the value of what you're doing is the difference between Y and X, rather than just using the value of X itself. I won't go into this because this is a bit more detailed and we're running out of time, but really, this is talking about the idea that it might also be worth benchmarking your brand against another comparative brand when no brand protection is being carried out, because actually it might be that the changes you're seeing are reflective of changes that are happening across the industry in general. So if you were to be working in an industry where generally infringements were going up over time, then actually the impact is even more than we thought, because we can basically say that your infringement level would have been even higher than it started at if we weren't doing the enforcement. Moving on to think about brand value. So this is an area that's quite often neglected in return on investment calculations. This is the idea that the brand intellectual property has an intrinsic value, including and sort of encompassing its potential to generate future revenue. And really things like brand visibility and customer loyalty will impact on the brand value. The converse to that is obviously if you have infringements going on online and you don't tackle them, then that will damage your brand value. So here we're thinking about things like unauthorized use of your IP, so counterfeit sales, fraud, false affiliation, instances where the brand is being diluted, so other people using your brand name to describe generic products, and any other reputational damage, so people boycotting the company, activism, anything like that can affect the brand value, and that's really what we're looking to try and formulate here. Really, this slide is just sort of saying, you know, the numbers are big here. So this is a global study that was looking year on year at the total global enterprise value of listed companies. And these numbers are in hundreds of trillions of US dollars. So really, the point here is that these are big numbers, and it's worth sort of taking it into account. There's a number of components to brand value. Again, I won't go through all of that in detail here, but really to say that brand itself represents a significant proportion of global enterprise value, and typically we reckon it's something like 20% on average across all sectors. So when we're looking at these numbers here of hundreds of trillions of dollars, actually damage to your brand is doing a really big bit of damage to your company value, your company bottom line. So this really is how we kind of try and formulate it. So if you leave infringements active, it will damage your brand. Conversely, if you remove infringements, that will have a positive impact on your brand. And those impacts really are of two main types. There are what we term brand impact. So that is, if you're taking things down, there is generally improved brand awareness, familiarity, customer loyalty. Your brand looks better, brand perception increases, brand reputation is more positive. And if you're taking down infringements, that has direct financial impacts for your company, things like increased sales volume, reduced costs to actually tackle the infringements and so on. Really, the overall thing to sort of take away here is that you have a particular brand value. You will need to spend money on your brand protection program, which is the sort of downward red bar you can see here. But if that brand protection program is successful, there will be an uplift in both those brand impacts and those financial impacts. And if your program is successful, then you hope that the uplifts are greater than the spend, and your net brand value on the right-hand side there is greater than the value you started at. So again, it's another way of kind of illustrating that your brand protection program has had value. Essentially, it's added direct brand value to your organization. Final thing I just wanted to touch on here is another area where you can sort of think about sort of return on investment. So this is really thinking about proactive rather than reactive measures. So here I'm thinking about cybersecurity and domain security. So really what we're thinking about here is things that corporations can do to reduce the risk of a cyber attack. So that will be putting particular domain security products and measures in place. Again, formulation here, I won't go through in too much detail, other than to say that really this is something that comes out of mathematical probability theory. Again, I can talk to people if they want to talk about it in a bit more detail. But the idea really is that your expected financial loss due to a cyber attack in a particular year is the probability of that attack happening multiplied by the cost or the damage to your company if that attack does happen. The key thing here really is to say that if you're able to reduce the probability of that attack through putting domain security measures in place, then there is essentially an expected saving due to the implementation of those security measures. Obviously, that's pretty easy to formulate, but pretty hard to quantify. However, there are some numbers that are kind of illustrative here. Now, DNS attacks, these types of cyber attacks are a big problem. 88% of organizations were subject to an attack like this in 2021. There's probably some more updated stats, but that's kind of one of the most recent studies that kind of gives a good overview. And every time a company is attacked, it typically costs them £1 million to sort of $1 million to fix the damage. So if you're able to reduce the probability of that attack happening from 10% to 1% in a particular year, then you're saving your company $90,000. So again, if your domain security products are costing less than that, then it's a positive return on investment and it's something worth doing. Okay, so moving into the final part of the presentation here, we've talked about various ways these calculations can be formulated, but there are other pieces of data that you can use. All of these can be kind of put into a, if you like, a made to measure return on investment formulation calculation if you want. If you're doing enforcement, then you might see increases in numbers of visitors to your physical stores, volumes of traffic to your official websites, increases in sales through the buy button on marketplaces. If you're taking other kinds of legal action, you may be reclaiming fines or damages. And again, if you're doing on the ground offline actions, so seizures, raids, and so on, again, you're taking products out of the infringement supply chain. And all of those numbers can be sort of built into your return on investment formulation. You may need to make adjustments based on the type of infringement. So things like the conversion rates, the substitution rates may be different depending on the type of infringement and the way in which those infringements are manifesting themselves. It's also worth bearing in mind that rather than just thinking about monitoring and enforcement, there are other brand protection approaches a brand owner can do that can have value and can sort of stop the damage that's being done through the infringement supply chain. So having things like product verification tools in place where buyers can check that they're buying the legitimate item can be very valuable. Similarly, as I sort of touched on earlier, educating your customers in the dangers of buying counterfeits can be very valuable as well. As I've sort of alluded to throughout the presentation, there are always caveats. There are some fundamental caveats, which is that, you know, some views of brand protection is that really you can just view it as one component of a broader strategy of IP management. And you can just view these as business operation costs rather than revenue generators in their own right. So some of the stuff that you might need to do as a brand owner, so having an effective trademark portfolio, acquiring domains for future use, even if it's not easy to formulate a return on investment calculation, or you don't believe it, you know, there is still intrinsic value in doing these things. It's all about future proofing your business and reducing the risk of infringements in the future. It's also worth saying that some types of enforcement, which are the ones that are really not easy to quantify, so for example getting notices or legal action for assurances from infringers not to infringe again, or taking actions where maybe the numbers are not really very readily available, they might even have higher impact than simple takedowns. So again, as I've alluded to just now, it's sometimes worth thinking in terms of infringements avoided in the future, so-called high impact enforcement, rather than in takedowns that you've actually done. I guess the final thing to say is that, you know, depending on the assumptions you make, you can kind of almost get any number out that you like. It's really important not to get too hung up on the numbers. And actually, if you get a number saying, you know, you should be able to reclaim $100 million from your brand protection program, that's not always, you know, the real world. Sometimes it's better to sort of use these approaches, but almost just think of them in terms of comparisons or point systems. So if you use a like for like return on investment formulation, you can compare one product's success against another, and that sometimes is a more helpful way to think about things. So in terms of key takeaways, obviously brand protection covers a range of initiatives and it addresses a range of issue types, and it's not necessarily straightforward to quantify the value of a program, as we've seen. Really what I've aimed to do in this presentation is set out a series of the standard methodologies that people do use, and sort of try and illustrate that they can be applied and adapted as part of a general framework to calculate the value in any particular case. And generally, whenever you're formulating a return on investment setup, you will agree with the brand owner the assumptions that you're making, the numbers that you're using, and the specifics will tend to vary from case to case. Your standard methodologies tend to use constructions in the form of what we've shown here. So ROI as the product of some measure of the cost, so the revenue difference between an infringement being active and being removed, and E, which is the number of enforcements. And we've seen that there's a couple of areas where that approach is most easily applicable. In other areas, you can use a similar idea, but you sometimes need to use data proxies. So we talked about things like the likes and followers on social media, number of downloads for mobile apps, and so on. But you can extend these ideas, and you can kind of make the formulation as sophisticated as you like. So the four areas we talked about that are kind of things to think about is whether you want to use variable substitution rates based on things like price differentials between legitimate and infringing items. You might want to use an approach that kind of reflects the long-term impact of your program, so showing how the landscape has changed over time based on the enforcements that you've been doing. You might want to try and quantify the impact of your brand protection on brand value. So that's looking at, you know, the positive impact of taking infringements down on things like your brand's reputation. And obviously we've talked about things like cybersecurity, proactive measures, and how you can maybe quantify ROI in those types of contexts. Also worth bearing in mind that, you know, you can, if there's other data available, it's worth building it into your ROI approach. So if you have data on, you know, volumes of goods being shipped from particular websites and things, then you should build that into your approach. If you've got offline actions that you're doing, again, that's really important data at all. And, you know, beyond the simple takedowns, there are other things as a brand owner that have value in terms of preventing infringements. So things like the use of product verification tools, and talking about the high impact enforcement approaches. But really, I guess the one takeaway with this is that any ROI approach will have caveats associated with it. There is no one right answer. It's all about agreeing what assumptions and numbers that you're happy to use in your formulation. But really, hopefully, what we've tried to do here is just give you an idea of some of the frameworks that are most usually used. So that's the end of my presentation. I'll hand back to the other guys to wrap up.
Wow, wow. Thank you very much, David, for sharing your insights on brand value, brand protection, return on investment. This is fantastic. Your expertise has brilliantly illuminated the complexities of this critical subject. Alex, thank you very much for introducing us to David.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
I hope our audience learned a lot, and most importantly, if you find yourself that your brand has been affected by cyber squatters, phishing, and your reputation needs to be saved, or you need to quickly address the issues, please consider CII DRC as your trusted dispute resolution provider. You can find us, you can visit our website at ciidrc.org. Please follow us on the LinkedIn and the Twitter, and let's stay connected and continue our journey. Now, don't miss our upcoming section on January 11th, titled Exploring Domain Name Dispute Evolution, spotlighting women's contribution. And again, sincere thank you to our esteemed guests, and I wishing you all joyous holiday and a happy new year, and I look forward to a future collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for listening. Okay, bye. Take care.
Bye.